My topic for today is survivors, victims, agency in Bosnia and Herzegovina, self-identification and conceptualization of sexual violence experiences. Through the readings of women's narratives in Bosnia, I explored how the ethno-national victimhood discourse silenced many women and alienated them from the survivors in other ethnic groups, but also within the same ethnic group. One of the solutions for the imposed positioning and labeling might be to claim the right to self-identification, as Rebecca Stringer and Alison Cole suggest in their work, and to enable what they call liberatory epistemology, with woman's body as the locus of meaning and experience, as Tammy Spry proposes in her oral history work. In this paper, I look into the body politics of ethnicization of women's bodies, how feminist debate and the language about victimhood, survivorship, and agency empower and disempower women, and how to go beyond the victim-survivors binary imposed both by international donor politics, scholarship, and women's organizations. When it comes to body politics, sexual violence and other forms of violence in this region are gendered and ethnicized, because gender and nation, as Julie Mustow concludes, intimately participate in the formation of one another. During the wars in the Balkans, women were the main targets of sexual violence and mass rapes, and they were targeted because their bodies represented one of the three main ethnic groups, the body of the nation. Femininity, masculinity, and heterosexuality, as Dubravka Žarkova explored in the Balkans, were crucial in production of ethnicity and ethnicized bodies. Women's body was a battlefield, and it is still a battlefield, an object for many scholars, practitioners, and ethnic and religious communities. The body represents primarily the ethnic and national paradigm of purity, chastity, and sacredness. So the second question is about conceptualization of victim and survivor's identity. Victimhood, survivorship, and agency are widely debated in scholarships of many disciplines, but understanding and the interplay between them in the lives of women who survived wartime rape and other forms of violence in recent war requires also exploration of various factors such as political, social, cultural, and etc. So my focus in this paper is language as one of the very important factors of learning, knowing, and reflecting. In discursive frameworks, people learn about themselves, but they also learn how to position themselves. And since the language is not only reflecting the social reality, but also constitutes it, the subject as well, her or his experience, are revealed through the language. When scholars and practitioners or women who survived sexual violence use certain words like victims, survivors, raped women, agents, women who survived rape, etc., it is a political act. What they want to communicate, or what somebody who is helping them or exploring the subject matter wants to convey. So the notion victim, žrtva in Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian language is every day in communication, person to person who survived various types of violence that has happened beyond their control. Some women use this term because it is important, as they explain, to draw attention to the status of many victims who need help, but underline that they work against what they call conspiracy of silence in order to regain their identities and the identities of women who shouldn't bear shame or stigma. Another label is survivor or preživjeli, which means as empowering notion, which seems as empowering notion with positive traits as active agents who survived violence, who decided to continue with their lives, to move on, and that is not hard so much for them to continue. Many women, however, use both terms interchangeably without assigning particular weight of meaning to either of these notions. Some women, however, do not want to be labeled as victims or survivors, but as women who experience certain types of violence, or simply human beings who suffered or who experience injustice. For them, any narrative, any story about violence is contextualized and personalized, and they do not want to dwell in these two categories, but instead they want to have freedom to self-conceptualize their own experiences. They want their own story to articulate what they have experienced as women and human beings. The majority of women have chosen silence as a method of survival and sacrifice their own subjectivity, pain, and suffering for bigger cause, for the sake of their own families, and they usually internalize the narratives of victimhood and oppressive scripts, and they did what Uma Narayan calls bargaining with patriarchy in order to survive the social norms imposed on them. It is important to recognize not only the oppression of the patriarchal societies, but also the disguised oppression of the well-intended neoliberal discourse that perceive gender structural oppression, and I quote, as individual problems of personal responsibility or as depoliticized social problem. The rhetoric of personal responsibility, agency, and gender-neutral language make victims, survivors, or women who suffered from violence responsible for recovery and healing. And if they are not successful in that process, as some women reported, and they are not fully recovered from these experiences, they are personally responsible for that. Some women face difficulties in meeting the expectations of the survivor identity, to be strong, to be empowered, and ready to change. A woman who was 14 when she was raped and who got married after the war and who didn't find understanding in her marriage and her environment narrates, and I will quote her statement. When I reported my rape for the first time, everybody was talking about me as a victim. And in the beginning, I didn't mind. When I noticed that people feel pity for me, referring to me as that poor woman, jadnica, I couldn't accept it anymore. So I decided to embrace the label survivor, which was something powerful, something that tells people she is not a poor woman, she is not jadnica. She's a fighter, she can handle this. But over time, I realized I couldn't handle it. I didn't feel better, and despite all therapy I received, I have been through, I'm really scared and I have the same fears, and yet everybody expects me to feel better and to be courageous as a survivor. So it is really hard for her, because somebody is trying to impose these identities on her. This is typical victim-survivor paradox described, and it discloses a deep psychological dilemma over her identities and coping with her trauma and expectations. As Monica Thompson explains in her work, this paradox, and I quote, being a victim maximizes the possibility that the awfulness of rape can be appreciated, but adopting a victim identity also runs a risk of being pitied and regarded as weak. If one adopts survivor identity, then the trauma of rape must be minimized and silence given to one's recovery from the rape. While this may afford the survivor respect from others, it renders her unable to talk about her experience or elicit support and sympathy from others should need arise. Tammy Spry answers that the reality in which we live doesn't recognize the complexity and diversity of women's experiences with sexual violence. She wants women to make new language and meanings because the existing categories, victim and survivor, are phallocentric and describe a woman as a victim of men's action. Some women do not want to be defined as someone's action, but by their primary identities as women and human beings whose integrity was violated by someone's action. Tammy Spry therefore suggests liberatory epistemology, which is, as she explains, is a liberation of ways of knowing, of exploring how we know what we know, the discovery of a room or a body of one's own, a site where a woman might tell a story of sexual violence, where she or her body is the locus of meaning and experience. The problem, however, remains how to develop women-centered language that is emancipatory and liberating within the hegemonic power of socially constructed views about sexual violence. What are the tools available and how to make them accessible to women and make the new vocabulary acceptable in the society? Knowing that most of us use cognitive shortcuts to define something without due respect for one's experience. how to develop new vocabulary in the Bosnian society and Bosnian culture, in which woman and her body is not a subject, but rather an object owned by man, family, or a nation. How to produce new knowledge and pursue emancipatory practices when the language discourse is masculinized and subordinated to oppressive gender roles. These are all questions we do not have answers, but we are searching for them. One of the ways to provide a forum to narrate women's experiences and open dialogue with the new vocabulary is to open dialogue with the new vocabulary. Through stories and dialogue, women can gain recognition and build self-respect. With the new language tools, women can self-identify how they want and how they feel. And I will just make small digression, because all of these data I collected from 2006 to 2011 when I was working with returnee women in Eastern and Western and Central Bosnia. And the project was about psychosocial support and integration of these women in the society, but it happened many times that they wanted to share these kind of stories and dilemmas and expectations, both families, societies, and even donors, and even those who were helping them had from them. So one of the solutions proposed by postmodern feminist scholarship is that the gesture of reclaiming the right for self-identification lies between the poles of celebration and jettison, making reclaiming a satisfactory way to frame the response that is needed. If women feel safe and comfortable with the victim or survivor identity, they should not be pressured to meet the expectations of victim and anti-victim feminist claims. If they want something else, then they feel that they best can reflect how they want to be perceived. They need to be allowed to construct a new language shaped by their own experiences. The language comes through narration of their stories, which makes their experiences known and provides self-recognition and recognition of others. However, the challenge is not only to provide the space for these narratives, but also to prepare other women to listen to these experiences without ethnicization, nationalization, and politicization of pain, suffering, and survivor-victim agency that is limited by the dominant ethno-national discourses in this country. Thank you.